Hello everyone, and welcome to my 2024 Christmas special where I will be sharing and talking about my top 25 favorite games of all time. This is a series that I've done in years previous as posts on my social media, and now that I've got a good bit of editing skills under my belt, I wanted to revisit it in video form. Before we proceed, I want to clarify that I'm abiding to the rule of one game per franchise, with the exception of spin-off games whose genres are different from the main series. So, for example, if a game from a platformer franchise is on this list, no others in the series will appear, but a spin-off party game from the same franchise is fair game. Additionally, I combed through a lot of games when compiling this, and while several of the games on the upper end of the list are pretty firm in their placements, the list as a whole is ever changing, and there were several games that just barely missed the cut that I'd like to give an honorable mention to. These games, in no particular order, are Unreal Tournament 2004, The World Ends With You, The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, Lunistis, Kena Bridge of Spirits, PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, Guitar Hero 3 Legends of Rock, Mario Party 8, Rivals of Aether 2, Splatoon, and Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. I tried my best to minimize spoilers in this series, but I would still err on the side of caution when watching because some of them were unavoidable. And please remember that this is all my opinion, and with that said, I hope you all enjoy my top 25 favorite video games of all time. Let's begin. Comic books aren't really a medium I've ever consumed, so my primary exposure to superheroes has always been through adaptations such as film and TV shows. I don't think this makes me any less of a fan, however, and while I do tend to lean towards preferring the Marvel superheroes, a notable exception is Batman. The more grounded to reality approach of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy has permanently sold me on the Caped Crusader, and this is extended further into the Arkham series of video games, of which my favorite is the first game, Arkham Asylum. Arkham City tends to get the most praise for its expansion of the first game's groundwork and the large open world to traverse, but I prefer Arkham Asylum's smaller scope, with all of its action taking place on the titular island. The feeling of isolation gives the game a strong, foreboding atmosphere, and I love how, while you start off with very little area to explore, the area as a whole expands as you progress further along and upgrade your inventory of gadgets, giving the game a very Metroidvania-like feel to it. The combat is also very well done, with direct confrontations having a wonderful flow to them that reward you for knowing how to properly time and chain together your options. Additionally, the stealth sections, or Predator mode as the game likes to call them, provide a completely different change in pace, with you having to very cleverly pick off a bunch of armed enemies one by one without being detected. I'm generally not a fan of stealth in video games since I scare quite easily, but Arkham Asylum does them so well that I enjoy them nonetheless. Add on a great story with a lot of twists and turns that kept me engaged the whole time, and Batman Arkham Asylum to me sets the benchmark for not only superhero games, but also action-adventure games. Tie-in video games based off of licensed properties tend to get a bad rep. Not entirely unjustified considering how many of them exist that are just utter slop, but the reason I'm sad that they've largely vanished in the modern age is because of the occasions where, hidden beneath all the garbage, is a true gem of a game. Nothing beat the feeling of playing an amazing video game based off of one of your favorite films or TV shows, but one of the crown jewels of licensed games is none other than Toy Story 2: Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue. Living up to one of the greatest animated films of all time is a ridiculously high bar, and while I would never expect any tie-in game to come even close to matching Toy Story 2's quality, Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue does a pretty damn good job. This game, at its core, is a clone of other 3D platformers of its era, such as Super Mario 64. It follows the exact same structure, with you taking control of Buzz as he traverses wide-open levels, all while completing objectives in order to collect Pizza Planet tokens, the game's equivalent to Mario's Power Stars. And although it's a 3D Mario clone through and through, it is a really good one. The controls are crisp and in my opinion have aged better than a lot of its contemporaries, including Super Mario 64 itself. The designs of each level are amazing, and each one does a wonderful job of giving off the vibe of what it would be like to traverse a giant world as a small toy. A lot of the levels are directly based off of locales in the film, such as Andy's house and Al's toy barn, but even when the game takes some creative liberties, nothing ever feels out of place for the world of Toy Story. Except for maybe the second boss being a weirdly sentient slime monster? And I haven't even begun to talk about how good the soundtrack for this game is. I don't know what possessed the composers to go as crazy as they did, but I love all of it. Every single song fits the vibe of the areas they play in, and it goes a long way in providing to the general atmosphere of the game. Really, my only criticism with Toy Story 2 is that you can kinda tell that the last few levels and final boss are a bit rushed, but that alone doesn't even come close to negating all of the amazing qualities this game has. Toy Story 2: Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue is a diamond in the rough amongst tie-in games. It's easily one of the most fun 3D platformers of the 5th generation, and I cannot recommend it enough. Give it a try if you haven't played it before. The Batman Arkham series might be the one that laid the groundwork for the modern superhero video game, but for me, the game that took what Arkham started and codified it into an absolute masterpiece has to be Insomniac's Spider-Man on PS4. I say this without having fully completed Miles Morales or even having started Spider-Man 2. I'm so sorry, I have a huge backlog of games that I take forever to get through, so the later installments may have further improved on this game and I'm simply unaware, but I still vividly remember getting Spider-Man when it came out back in 2018 and loving every single minute of it. Fun fact, this game was actually ranked 2nd place on my top 20 list that I made back in early 2019, which shows just how highly I regarded it at the time, and while it's had quite a fall since then, I attribute this less to any lowering opinion of this game and more so my increased opinion of so many other games in the 6 years that have passed since making that list. But I digress. Spider-Man, as I said before, takes all of the groundwork laid out by the Batman Arkham series and refines it. The combat is strikingly similar, but with a more quick and agile feel to it that much better fits Spidey's fighting style while also still having the fluidity and rhythm that the Arkham games have. Traversing through the large open map of New York is fantastic due to how well implemented the web slinging is, and despite the gargantuan size of the areas you have to explore, I found it so much less cumbersome to get from one area to another compared to Arkham City. I even found it to be immensely fun flying from building to building, looking for all the little side collectibles you can get, and I'm generally someone who does not care for side quests. I'm not quite as big on the stealth sections that pop up here though. The ones where you do quiet takedowns on enemies with Spidey himself are fine, though not quite as fun to me as the equivalents from the Arkham games, but the sections where you have to play as either Mary Jane or Miles Morales felt like a lot more of a drag to me. The section where Spidey and Mary Jane team up, however, is a notable exception. What really sells Spider-Man to me over the Arkham games, however, is the story. This isn't to say that the Arkham games have bad stories, as I do quite enjoy them as well. Spider-Man stories tend to just have a much more personal touch to them, courtesy of how relatable Peter Parker is, and this game absolutely leans into that relatability hard, and it pays off. The whole time I was completely invested in how the story was going to turn out. Even with prior knowledge of Spider-Man mythos suggesting how some things would pan out, I was still kept on my toes the entire time. Overall, Spider-Man is a wonderful superhero game that does an amazing job of immersing you in the experience. It really makes you feel like Spider-Man. I'm so sorry, I had to. When it was announced back in 2020 that they were making a game where you played as a cat, I was beyond excited, for no reason more than the simple fact that you played as a cat. I love cats. They're one of my favorite animals ever. I will die for this little house goblin that has spent the past 4 years being an absolute nuisance to me and my allergies and barfing all over the house, but also being the sweetest little thing ever. I love her. The mere premise of Stray sold me on the game years before it actually released. Being a cat, doing cat things, and solving puzzles as a cat, I don't know what else they could have done to make me want this game anymore. And then I played it and, oh my god. Stray has one of the most compelling narratives I've ever experienced in any game to date, and it's a puzzle game, where you play as a cat! Hidden beneath its cute exterior lies a dark tale of a human civilization that took shelter from a catastrophe in a quarantined city, but has long since been wiped out by a plague of mutated creatures called the Zurks, leaving behind nothing but the humans' robotic companions that have since become sentient and taken control of the society within this city. As you puzzle and platform your way through various areas, trying to help the cat find their way back to their family, you meet new companions and slowly uncover pieces of the story of how this city came to be in the state that it is. It's a pretty somber and even outright depressing story, but within all of the darkness always remains a glimmer of hope. One of the prevailing themes in the game's story is the legacy that humanity has left behind, and how, even long after their demise, that legacy continues on in those that have succeeded them. It's a very powerful message in a game where you play as a cat. The novelty of a puzzle platformer where you're a cat would have won me over by itself, but Stray takes it a step further by providing one of the most incredible narratives I've ever had the joy of experiencing in a video game. I honestly feel like I haven't ranked too low on this list, but much like what I said with Spider-Man, I think that's simply a testament to every other game ranked above it. I truly believe everyone should experience Stray at least once. Unless you hate cats or something, I guess. But if you hate cats, what the hell is wrong with you? Spend about 5 seconds with me and you will very quickly learn that I adore Yu-Gi-Oh! It has been one of my favorite franchises since I was 8 years old, and the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game has been the longest lasting hobby that I have ever been invested in. This love extends to many of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games, and while I do like many of the later titles released on DS and PC, ultimately they're just a digital way of playing a game that I can already experience in person. So the video games in the series that tend to draw my attention the most are the older titles that took quite a few more liberties in their design. Enter Yu-Gi-Oh! The Duelist of the Roses, quite possibly the most unique take on not only the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, but also the entire Yu-Gi-Oh! Mythos. The plot of Duelist of the Roses is very far removed from any other property in the franchise. Rather than taking place in ancient Egypt, the story involves the player being pulled from the present day into 15th century England during the War of the Roses. You are then tasked with taking one of the two sides of the war and fighting through several characters of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, taking on the roles of major historical figures of the time. No, I'm serious. It's absurd as hell. Henry Tudor literally says that he has grown tired of that name and prefers to be called Yugi. But Yu-Gi-Oh! As a franchise has always leaned quite hard into the absurdity of the fate of mankind lying in the hands of a trading card game, and it's that absurdity that makes me love it so much. Beyond the quite unique premise, what really sets Duelist of the Roses apart from any of the other games in the franchise is its gameplay. Whereas its predecessor Forbidden Memories uses a very simplified version of the real-life card game's rules, and modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Games use the actual game's rules to a T, Duelist of the Roses takes a completely different route, with gameplay taking place on a 7x7 grid. You place one card from your hand on the board per turn and actually move the cards around, all while taking advantage of field power bonuses from the various terrains that each individual tile can adorn. Imagine if you mixed the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game with a tactical RPG and chess, and you get the gameplay of Duelist of the Roses. It's one of a kind, and I love every bit of it. The game isn't completely devoid of the problems that plague many older Yu-Gi-Oh! Games, such as a high difficulty and a need to grind for good cards, provided you don't know the right passwords, which you couldn't possibly know without a cheat guide, but even on this front, it's far less egregious than the likes of Forbidden Memories, and what is there is fun enough that I'm able to look past that aspect of it. If you're a Yu-Gi-Oh! Fan, or even if you're not, I'd recommend giving Duelist of the Roses a shot. I've already talked about how Toy Story 2 is a rare case of a fantastic 3D platformer based on an existing property, but another, even more obscure hidden gem of a tie-in game is Disney's 102 Dalmatians: Puppies to the Rescue. Despite its name, the game exists in a weird mix and match dimension, being based on some aspects of the namesake film 102 Dalmatians, but also drawing heavy inspiration from the animated universe of the classic 101 Dalmatians film. And if my memory of the live-action 102 Dalmatians serves correctly, that movie is not great, so maybe it's a good thing that this game is a loose adaptation of it at best. Whereas Toy Story 2 took a lot of its beats from Super Mario 64, Puppies to the Rescue goes in a different direction, instead being very heavily inspired by Spyro the Dragon. The plot involves Oddball and Domino setting out to rescue their siblings from the clutches of Cruella de Vil before she coats them all in a super adhesive known as Super Gloop and selling them as realistic dog toys. Which, by the way, has to be one of the most messed up things Cruella has ever plotted to do, and that's really saying something. The game follows a linear level order, unlike Spyro, but individual levels have much of the same structure, being wide open areas for you to explore. Each level has 100 bones to collect and 6 puppies to rescue, akin to the gems and dragons of the first Spyro game, as well as other objectives that vary by level and can be something as simple as helping the animal companion of that level or outsmarting one of Cruella's henchmen. The base gameplay also takes inspiration from Spyro, with Oddball and Domino being equipped with a wide-ranged bark attack as well as a fast-moving roll, so it's very clear where the dev team got their ideas, and while it is very much a Spyro clone, much like Toy Story 2 to SM64, it's an incredibly well done one. And if that wasn't enough, the game also has a bunch of mini games that you can unlock and play if you ever want to break from the main game. There's some neat stuff like checkers, a tilt maze, and a foot race where you can play as several of the game's animal companions, but I think a special mention goes to the mini golf game that's available from the start and is just as addicting as the main game. Licensed tie-in games are always a mixed bag, but the rare great ones are always a treat to discover, and 102 Dalmatians Puppies to the Rescue is another example of such a game. I truly believe it's one of the most underlooked games of its era, and I cannot recommend it enough. I generally credit Crash Bandicoot 2 as being my first video game, seeing as it was the one amongst the batch of games I unwrapped Christmas morning in 1997 that I played first and by far the most. But also hidden within that pile was a little racing game called Jet Moto 2, the second video game that I ever played. As far as racing games go, I tend to prefer kart racers, but Jet Moto 2 has a different vibe from anything else I've played. Set in a futuristic but still familiar time, you take control of one of 10 racers as you compete in a racing competition across 10 tracks. Where Jet Moto 2 differs from other racing games is what exactly you're racing on. These aren't your run-of-the-mill race cars, you're racing on hover bikes that let you traverse all sorts of locales, from rocky mountains to open water, active volcanoes, a post-earthquake Los Angeles, underground mine shafts, a roller coaster, and even heaven and hell. The huge variety in track environments is one of the game's biggest strengths, but even with all that, it still has a ground of realism to it, with the entire game being played up as a huge sporting event filled with advertisements and sponsors throughout. The game is brutally difficult to control, but it's immensely rewarding to master, with you having total control of how your bike moves around in all directions, resulting in a game that is very satisfying to learn how to play once you get through the tough barrier of entry. Now, you may be wondering what the Championship Edition is, as Jet Moto 2 only ever got released as one version. Or did it? Despite these two copies of the game looking nearly identical, they're actually completely different. The Greatest Hits version, due to a production error, is actually a version of the game made specifically for the game's main developer that was never meant to be released to the public. Branded in-game as the Championship Edition, it features a higher frame rate, much greater top speed for all racers across the board, and every track, including those from the original Jet Moto, unlocked from the start. It's pretty hotly debated among Jet Moto fans as to which version of Jet Moto 2 is superior, but I grew up with the Championship Edition and it's the version I've always preferred. I like to go fast, and the choppy nature of the original Jet Moto 2 just doesn't hold a candle to the blistering speeds of the Championship Edition. I do understand those that find it to be too fast, however, and the original version of the game actually got a release on the PS4 and PS5 PlayStation Store that fixed all of the original PS1 release's frame rate issues. So with time, I could see myself gravitating towards that version of the game, but for now, the Championship Edition reigns supreme. With all that said, the Jet Moto franchise as a whole is a grossly underlooked series that has sadly been lost to time, and Jet Moto 2 is the series' pinnacle. If you want to experience a great racing game that's also a relic of a forgotten age, I definitely recommend picking this game up. The original version is available on the PlayStation Store for about $10, and it's well worth the money. Due to my strong attachment to the Crash Bandicoot series, it may come as a surprise to many that I actually am not that attached to the Spyro series. The two franchises, despite being very different in tone and style, share a close relation to each other even into the modern day. But as a kid, I only ever played a handful of the Spyro games, and of that handful, I only ever completed the first one. About 2 years ago, I did finally get around to playing the remaining two games in the original PS1 trilogy, and I can confidently say that I'm at the very least a big fan of those three games now. Spyro 3 got very close to taking the spot on this list, but ultimately the first game still wins out for me. Spyro the Dragon is 3D collectathon platforming in its simplest and purest form, and maybe it's the nostalgia speaking, but I just love that about it. There's no level-specific objectives, side missions, or vehicle or alternate character gimmicks to be found, just pure exploration around wide-open levels collecting all of the gems, dragons, and eggs that you can find. And I'm saying all of this as someone who loves the variety of content in the later two games. Hell, I did just say that I almost put Spyro 3 on the list, and that game is chock full of variety and content. But through Spyro 1's simplicity and its gameplay also comes a consistency and quality. While I do enjoy the higher highs that Spyro 2 and 3 have, I feel like there are far more instances where I found stuff to be either boring or downright frustrating, and that's just not a feeling I get often, if at all, when playing Spyro 1. There's a beauty in how straightforward the game is, and there's an almost magical feeling to the emptier yet simpler world of Spyro 1 compared to the busyness of its sequels. And the soundtrack is just so sublime. The entire trilogy is full of bangers thanks to the immense talent of Stuart Copeland, but Spyro 1's soundtrack in particular just stands out to me. I genuinely struggled to pick my favorite song to use as a background for this video, and even as I'm recording this audio, I can't help but second guess my choice. I don't know if there's a single song in the game I genuinely dislike. Spyro 1's soundtrack is probably in my top 5 favorite across all video games. Life is complex, and oftentimes things become fascinating or interesting because of depth and complexity, but other times there's a lot of comfort to be had in keeping things basic and straightforward, and I think Spyro the Dragon is a perfect example of how beautiful simplicity can be. The complete tonal shift going from Jak and Daxter to Jak 2 is, even to this day, extremely jarring, and you'll constantly hear people lament the fact that it happened or wish that the series had stuck to the lighthearted 3D collectathon gameplay of the first game instead of the darker, grittier, GTA-inspired gameplay that its sequels adopted. And I get it, I really do. I tend to prefer the lighthearted stuff as well, and Jak and Daxter is definitely a game that I have an immense amount of fondness for, but I'm sorry, I just really like Jak 2. I don't really know how best to describe it, but I almost feel like the direction the series took with Jak 2 is what was needed for both it and for Naughty Dog to stand out amongst an ever-growing crowd of competition. And considering that both Jak 2 and Jak 3 have left a more lasting impression on me than the first game, and considering what Naughty Dog went on to make after the Jak series, I think it was a success. When comparing Jak 1 to Jak 2, I love the latter's much bigger focus on storytelling, character development, and world building. Maybe it's a fondness for dystopian fiction, but Haven City to me is infinitely more interesting than the old world of Jak 1, and I love seeing how the plot of the city's war unfolds as well as how Jak develops as a character throughout it all. The rest of the game's cast, along with being vastly expanded compared to the first game, also have a great deal of fleshing out done for them as well, and the end result is an entire suite of characters that you develop a good amount of fondness or loathing for. And while Jak 2 does deviate a lot from not just the tone, but also the gameplay of Jak 1, I feel like it does it in a way that still stays true to it. The platforming aspects of Jak 1, while certainly downplayed, still exist and are a pivotal part of Jak 2's gameplay. And while the gunplay of Jak 2 is certainly distinct from the eco powers of the first game, I do think there's a lot of similar ideas overlapping between them. Having access to the morph gun at all times also gives you a lot more options in combat, which is greatly appreciated due to the dramatically increased difficulty. Do not get it twisted, Jak 2 is a hard game, and it has earned its reputation as such, but I barely ever feel like it's hard in a way that's unfair, and it rewards you for knowing how to make use of every option at your disposal. While Jak 2 is certainly a massive departure from its predecessor, I think it's done in a way where it feels like an evolution rather than a complete overhaul, and in my opinion it pays off, having left a lasting impression on me for years to come. The Sly series might not have gone through a dramatic tonal shift between installments like the Jak series did, but I would say from a gameplay perspective, the transition from Sly 1 to Sly 2 is pretty damn comparable to the evolution from Jak 1 to Jak 2. Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus is a very straightforward Crash Bandicoot-like 3D platformer, and in any other universe that would make it reign supreme as the best game in the franchise for me. But Sly 2 Band of Thieves ups the ante so much that even I can't say that I prefer the first game over it, taking the series in a direction that not only massively improves on almost every front, but also involves it in a way that feels natural, organic, and not at all jarring like the shift from Jak 1 to Jak 2 can be. Because the Sly series is about a group of thieves running around doing thief things, moving the gameplay away from level-to-level linear platforming to mission-based gameplay where you swap around all three members of the Cooper gang, traveling around single areas performing jobs to prepare for one massive heist is, quite frankly, the best thing they could have done to move the series forward. and it pays off in massive dividends, with every single job that you do feeling like it has significance to the overall goal of the characters. The characters themselves also deserve special mention. I already thought that the memorable cast was already one of the first game's biggest strengths, but Sly 2 takes even that and improves greatly on it. The development of the main trio can be seen clearly throughout the game, with all of them having a great deal of growth across every chapter. Even the antagonists have a great deal of depth to them as well, with everyone having their own agenda going on, serving as a means to constantly keep you on your toes, seeing how the story is going to unfold. Even with all of these changes though, Sly 2 still maintains the same general tone of the first game. It knows when to be serious and is certainly not devoid of extremely dark and sobering moments, but it just as much knows when to be goofy and lighthearted just like the first game. Mix all of this together and you have one of the most finely crafted games on the PS2. Every sequel should strive to be like Sly 2. Also, this game gave us Dimitri. You can't contest that.
I have no idea what you're saying. And your suit sucks.
Ever since Generation 5, Pokemon has tried very hard to make deep and emotional stories a key part of their games. And despite this, none of the mainline game's stories hold a candle to a spin-off game from the late 2000s. I don't even know how to properly begin describing Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers. At its core, it's really just a simple roguelike with some Pokemon gameplay elements mixed in. You've got the randomly generated maps that are standard for the genre, but it also very distinctly has a Pokemon flair to it, with you able to build an exploration team of 2 to 4 consisting of yourself, your partner, and whoever else you're able to recruit along the way. And while I do have some gripes with the gameplay and how brutally unforgiving it can be at times, it's nothing that I would consider outright offensive and overall is a fun time. But the gameplay isn't what makes this game so special. It's the story and the characters and just how memorable they all are. Not only do you, the player character, go through a great deal of growth, so does your partner and so does every other supporting character throughout the game. From the additional members of the guild your character joins to every NPC you meet in Treasure Town and beyond, no expenses were spared in crafting an absolutely wonderful world for you to be immersed in, growing attached to every single aspect of it. The crown jewel of Mystery Dungeon Explorers, however, is without a doubt its narrative. I really don't know how to describe it without spoiling it, and this is a game that I absolutely think everybody should go into without prior knowledge of the plot, but those who have played the game know. This is hands down the most incredible, heartwarming, gut-wrenching, tear-jerking story ever conceived by any Pokemon medium ever. It is nothing short of absolute beauty. Realistically, any of the 3 versions of Explorers could have gone here, but Explorers of Sky, as the 3rd version that was released a year later, is quite simply a straight upgrade compared to Explorers of Time and Explorers of Darkness, but the core experience remains the same throughout all 3. There's just simply no reason to play either of the first 2 versions if you have access to Sky. I really wish I could find the words to better describe how amazing this game is because I don't think I'm doing it justice. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers is hands down one of the finest pieces of art to come out of the Pokemon franchise. I honestly feel like I ranked it too low, but I guess that's a testament to the rest of the games on the list. Please give it a try if you haven't already. I promise it'll be worth it. I always struggle to find the words to describe why I love Final Fantasy VII so much, because what can I really say besides everything? Like, what is there to say about Final Fantasy VII that hasn't already been said by so many others before me? It has its reputation as a landmark title for a reason, and from the moment I played it for myself back in 2015, I knew that it absolutely deserved its reputation. I think the game's biggest strength is that it really does everything exceptionally well. The story is incredibly engaging, with a plethora of earth-shattering twists that keep the player invested the entire time. The gameplay is solid, maintaining the classic elements of turn-based RPGs while also having its own flair with the materia system and active time battle. The music is just immaculate, the world is absolutely huge with tons of stuff to do, and the graphics, while certainly nothing special by today's standards, were groundbreaking at the time the game came out. If I had to single out my favorite thing overall about Final Fantasy VII, however, I'd have to go with the characters. The way they're developed, their relationships with each other, the way that every single person in this game, from your party members to the supporting cast to even the antagonists, has something about them that either is relatable or makes you care for them, or in the case of the villains, just boils your blood and makes you hate everything about them. They all have something about them that makes them memorable. Honestly, I never feel like I do Final Fantasy VII justice when I talk about it. Not when I first played it, and not now while recording this video. It's just such a hard game to put into words what makes it so special, and there are others out there who have done a much better job of it than I'm probably doing right now. So, I'm gonna recommend you one such video. The Impact of Final Fantasy VII, the game that changed everything, is a video by Super Eyepatchwolf that I myself watched while trying to figure out what to say for this video. So if my probably poor attempt at selling you on why I love this game so much failed, maybe this video can give a better picture of what makes it so good. I'll leave a link to it in the description, but in the meantime, I don't know how else to sum up what makes Final Fantasy VII so amazing except everything. I feel like over the past few years, the gaming sphere has suffered from what I like to call the Last of Us fatigue. You're naturally going to have some naysayers towards anything that becomes popular, but when you have years upon years of people propping up The Last of Us as the greatest story ever told in a video game, I think it's perfectly normal for people to have their feathers just a little ruffled by the overexposure. I myself am included in this. The constant overabundance of praise, combined with my very mixed reaction towards The Last of Us Part 2, kinda soured me on the series overall. But after a couple years away from it and time allowing me to reevaluate my feelings on the second game, I decided to revisit the original by playing the PS5 remake, and honestly, it was just as good as I remembered it being. I'm not gonna go as far as to proclaim it as the greatest story ever told in a video game. Hell, I don't even think it's the greatest story told in a Naughty Dog game. But make no mistake, The Last of Us Part 1 is an incredible game. Even though its basic plot is very simple and the concept of a zombie apocalypse is one that was done quite a lot by the mid-2010s, it's the way that The Last of Us executes it that makes it such a memorable experience. The game pulls no punches when showing the brutality of what a post-apocalyptic world would be like, with every character, including the main protagonists, being forced to make extremely questionable decisions constantly. Every single person in this game is morally gray, or worse, and it's made perfectly clear that Joel, the main protagonist of the game, is not a quote-unquote good person. And it's the interactions between these characters that really sell the game beyond its simple plot. Throughout the journey, you see how the relationship between Joel and Ellie grows, and how their experiences across the entire year in which the game takes place, and the people they meet along the way, shape their characters and the bond that they have. The end result is a cast of characters that you grow to care for immensely. This is further complemented by the gameplay. Resources such as ammo and supplies to craft items are extremely limited, forcing you to search every nook and cranny for even the slightest amount of useful tools to use, and causes you to really think about how to best utilize what items you have at your disposal. And combat greatly encourages being tactical and stealthy when dealing with the various types of enemies you'll come across, and punishes you very hard for being reckless. It's a shockingly realistic take on the genre, and I think that's what makes The Last of Us Part 1 stand out amongst the crowd of all of its contemporaries, and the PS5 remake, while certainly not necessary, is in my opinion the definitive way to play it, so if you are interested in giving the game a go and have access to that version, I highly recommend it. For basically all my life, I have praised Crash Team Racing as one of the greatest kart racers ever made. For a game released in 1999, it features extremely crisp controls, fast gameplay, great visuals, and deep mechanics that could entertain any kart racing enthusiast even if they weren't a fan of Crash Bandicoot. So when they announced a full-blown remake in 2019, my response was very cautious optimism. Obviously I wanted it to be good, but how could anything possibly top an already incredible game? Well, Crash Team Racing Nitro Fuel did not fail to deliver. Just about everything that made me love the original Crash Team Racing was preserved and even improved upon, giving us not only, in my opinion, the strongest Crash game of the Revival era, but also one of the finest kart racers out there. The high-octane gameplay of the original CTR was translated over very nicely to nitro-fueled, and while it doesn't handle the exact same, I would say that overall I get a very similar feeling from both of them. The graphics are also absolutely jaw-dropping. I said in my Crash game ranking video last year that Nitro Fueled builds upon the graphical foundation set by the Insane trilogy and improves it to a level that even Crash 4 can't compete with, and that's a statement that I stand by. This game is gorgeous, with even the most bland tracks from the original games having received a lot of love to be as lively as they've ever been. Speaking of tracks, the decision to remake not only the original 18 CTR tracks, but also the 13 from its sequel Crash Nitro Kart, all with their own massive graphical overhauls, was an incredible decision. I always felt like the track design in CNK was stellar, but held back by a bland aesthetic and much clunkier controls, but Nitro Fueled does away with both of those problems and finally allows those tracks to shine as well. And the content doesn't end there. Along with every playable character from both original games, you are able to unlock a near limitless amount of other things in the game's pit stop, from additional bonus characters to paint jobs, wheels, kart models, and the works. It's all aesthetic, which keeps the game from being pay to win, and while it was clearly designed to favor the unfortunately likely Activision-mandated microtransactions, it's not impossible to reasonably grind for enough of the in-game coins in a short amount of time to pick and choose what you want, and allows you to give yourself a lot more of a personal flair when playing. I've gushed and gushed about everything that makes Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled amazing, but it would be remiss of me to not talk about the game's shortcomings, because while the quantity of said shortcomings is very few, they are unfortunately extremely significant. The game's load times are probably the single biggest offender. They already weren't great to begin with, but subsequent updates failed to optimize them and in fact made them even worse, to the point that even on 9th gen consoles you'll find yourself waiting for upwards of 30 seconds to load into a race. And God forbid you're playing on an original model PS4, Xbox One, or a Nintendo Switch. The online has also always been very spotty, and while I do think that during the game's heyday people vastly overstated how bad it was, the current state of it is borderline unplayable if you don't have a dedicated group to form lobbies with. Part of that is certainly due to the game's player base being much smaller than it was 5 years ago, but I do think the problems that online suffered from have only been exacerbated with time. I also used to not really care about the game only running at 30 frames per second, but after playing a lot of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe due to the Booster Course Pass, and even doing some speedruns of the original CTR, it's a bit nauseating to come back to this game, especially since they mask the frame rate with an absurd amount of motion blur. None of these problems are nearly enough to dampen my overall experience with Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled though. For every critical flaw that it has, there's about 10 things that it does tremendously well, and it more than deserves its spot as one of my favorite racing games. Crash Team Racing may have been the game that ignited my love for kart racers, and Nitro Fueled and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe continue that love into the modern day, but for all of the time in between, there's never been a kart racer quite like Mario Kart Double Dash. I don't feel like it's an exaggeration at all to say that this is the most unique game in the Mario Kart series, but it's also, in my opinion, the point where the series really hit its stride. The double racer gimmick is exactly that, a gimmick, but you can't deny that it's pretty awesome to be able to put together pairs of characters that would otherwise never team up. The accompanying special item mechanic that each intended pair of characters exclusively has makes specific character choice feel like it matters far more than I feel like it does in most other Mario Kart titles. The game's fluid but fast-paced speed, coupled with the 16 racers at any given time resulting in a lot more items flying around, makes Double Dash quite possibly the most chaotic Mario Kart game of all, and I love that about it. In later titles, I often find a poorly timed red shell to be a nuisance, but in Double Dash, when I get bombarded by an entire cavalry of items, I can't help but laugh at the sheer absurdity. It's unbalanced and hectic as all hell, but that's what makes it so fun. I also love the fact that, alongside with the 4 standard cups, there's also an all-cup tour, which is a Grand Prix of all 16 courses, with all but Luigi's Circuit and Rainbow Road randomized. I know that you can kinda get something similar with the Versus Mode customization in later Mario Kart games, but it's not quite the same when I can't guarantee the start and end courses but mix up everything else. I don't know, it just doesn't hit the same way to me. Which brings me to my next point. Even though the amount of content in this game has long since been completely eclipsed by Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, I still can't help but come back to this game's suite of tracks and look back on it fondly, mostly because more than half of them aren't even in Mario Kart 8! Like, seriously, of the game's 16 tracks, only 7 of them are in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, including the Booster Course Pass. Hell, 4 of the game's courses have never been brought back at all! Why does Nintendo seem to have such a disdain for this game's courses? Give me Wario Coliseum, Mushroom City, and Rainbow Road, damn it! But I digress. If I'm being totally candid, I do also really love Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and for the longest time, that was the Mario Kart game that I was going to put on this list. Between its absurd amount of content with 96 tracks, amazing graphics, especially for an originally Wii U title, and the refining of the Mario Kart formula, it was really hard for me to argue any other game in the series being my favorite over it. But after revisiting Double Dash, it slowly sunk into me that, even if there's far much less in it compared to 8 Deluxe, what is there still has this magical feel to it that just hasn't ever really been replicated by another kart racer for me. And there is one other thing that made me select this game over 8 Deluxe. One of my best friends absolutely loved this game, and he was a freaking monster at it. I remember one time this year he came over to my house just to hang out and play it with me, and he completely destroyed me. I was blown away by just how good at it he was. I genuinely believe if he had ever decided to speedrun it, he would have been incredible at it. Sadly, he passed away not too long ago. Losing him has been one of the hardest things I've ever had to deal with, and playing Mario Kart Double Dash is one of the many great memories of him that I will always cherish. I'm not really a religious or a spiritual person, but if there is some afterlife beyond this one, then Safee, I hope you know how much you mean to me. I miss you, man, and I will continue to play this game forever for you. Pokemon has, for as long as I can remember, been one of the most significant media franchises in my life, and picking a favorite game among all of them is very difficult because, frankly, I really like all of them. I've actually been replaying the whole series on stream gradually over the past few years, with the most recent game I've completed being Heart Gold. In the past, the Johto remakes were always my go-to option for my favorite Pokemon game, and now that I've replayed them, I can confidently say that this is still the case. The margin between Heart Gold and Soul Silver and other games in the series such as Platinum, Fire Red and Leaf Green, and even Scarlet and Violet is really small, but at the end of the day, I think what puts Heart Gold and Soul Silver over the top for me is just how complete they feel compared to other Pokemon games. Gold, Silver, and Crystal, for all of their shortcomings that have become more apparent with time, already felt like some of the most complete Pokemon games to me even in my childhood, if anything due to the sheer amount of extra content having an entire second region brings to the table. I realize that Kanto in these games isn't as fleshed out as Johto is, even in the remakes, but there's just something special about coming back to an old region and seeing how much has changed in the 3-year time span between the games. It's like coming back to your hometown after being away for so long and seeing what's changed. And the bookend of the true final challenge in the game being the player character from the original Kanto games is just icing on the cake. It's common knowledge now, but I don't think it can be overstated just how shocking of a revelation that was back in 1999. This is all stuff that applies to all of the Johto games, but Heart Gold and Soul Silver take it up a notch by introducing so many improvements to the player experience, many of which didn't carry over into Black and White, which genuinely blows my mind to this day. Putting the menu on the bottom screen and therefore making more use of the DS's touchscreen than any other mainline Pokemon title on the platform was a fantastic decision. Taking it a step further, the option to permanently toggle the running shoes without holding a button and mapping up to 2 key items on the bottom screen as well just do so much to improve the overworld gameplay. And this is without even going into the abundance of content that Heart Gold and Soul Silver add to the original Johto experience. Integrating Lugia and Ho-Oh, and by extension the Kimono Girls, into the game's story, the addition of side activities like the Pokeathlon and the Battle Frontier, the restoration of several Kanto locations such as Viridian Forest, the Safari Zone, Cerulean Cave, the Seafoam Islands, and by extension adding an incredibly large amount of legendary Pokemon to catch if you so desire, the list just goes on and on. Now, Heart Gold and Soul Silver are far from perfect games. A poor level curve and lack of emphasis on Johto Pokemon in favor of Kanto Pokemon are two of Johto's most common criticisms, and while the former was sort of alleviated in some parts of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, neither problem was entirely fixed, and that does hold the games back. The level curve in particular forces you to either level grind an absurd amount or make use of the level 70 legendaries available in the late game to realistically take down the endgame challenges such as the Elite Four rematches and Red. Even with these shortcomings though, Heart Gold and Soul Silver remain to this day the most complete and fulfilling Pokemon games in my eyes. Maybe that'll change as I continue to replay Generations 5 and beyond, but for now, the Johto remakes and Generation 4 as a whole stand firm at the top.
Samuel, are you ready to seek your fortune?
I am of the apparently unpopular opinion that it is okay for things to end. I'd much rather see a story reach its natural conclusion and be laid to rest as opposed to being constantly milked until it's long since become a shell of its former self. The Uncharted series has been one of my favorite ever since I played the second game back in 2010, and one of the things that I think has allowed it to stand the test of time is that it never overstayed its welcome. Uncharted 4 is about as perfect of a conclusion as you could ever ask for in my opinion, and for a couple years now it has just barely edged out Uncharted 2 as my favorite game in the series. The margin is razor thin though. Uncharted 2 definitely wins out on the spectacle and the action, and while Uncharted 4 does improve on several aspects of the gameplay, I think what makes Uncharted 4 resonate so much with me is, as with many other games on this list, a much tighter focus on the characters and their relationships with each other. It was a formula for success with The Last of Us, so naturally it would also work well here. That isn't to say that the characters weren't a pivotal factor in the first 3 Uncharted games being great. In fact, that's always been one of my favorite things about the series. But Uncharted 4 takes it a step further by diving deeper into each character, their personalities, their backstories, and their relatability, and helping you understand why exactly they are the way that they are. This relatability can be felt as early as the game's start when you see Nathan Drake, long since retired from the treasure hunting business, trying to adjust to a normal life and struggling to do so. And after being thrust back into that world due to the sudden return of his long-lost brother, a trope that usually is a recipe for disaster, but in my opinion the game pulls it off well enough, it becomes abundantly clear as the game progresses that both he and his wife Elena were not satisfied with the mundanity of a normal life, and that's something that I think a lot of people can relate to. I can personally say from my own life experiences that the stability of a normal 9-to-5 job was absolute misery. I strived for something more fulfilling than just sitting in a cubicle, punching in numbers on a computer, and I ultimately chose to take the plunge into full-time content creation. With some DoorDash mixed in, reality is often disappointing. And I don't regret my decision at all. It is definitely the riskier road to take, but the path worth taking is never the easy one, and this is a message that Uncharted 4 hammers in hard. Another theme that is extremely prevalent in the game is the overpowering effect of greed and obsession. This can be seen through Sam's hellbent desire to find the treasure of Henry Avery, even if it's at the expense of those he cares about, as well as how the story gradually reveals that the pirates of Libertalia turned on each other out of greed and paranoia. But perhaps most of all, it reflects in the utter obsession of the game's main antagonist, Rafe Adler, who is, in my opinion, the greatest villain in the entire series. He may not be as physically menacing as Uncharted 2's Zoran Lazarevich, but I love him so much more for what he represents. A foil to Nate and Sam if they had gone down the path they did for all the wrong reasons. Contrasting Nate's love for treasure hunting purely for the sake of it and Sam's desire to find the treasure so it was something he could share with his brother, Rafe is in it only for the glory. He states himself that he was handed everything in his life on a silver platter and finding the treasure was something he wanted to earn and he would stop at nothing to do it. Rafe is the most realistic and relatable villain in the franchise, and that makes him all the more sinister. And the final one-on-one showdown with him in the game's final chapter is catharsis at its finest. Everything the characters go through in Uncharted 4 makes it all the more satisfying when the game ends on an unquestionably happy note. That happy ending was earned, and I'm immensely grateful that there have been no attempts on Naughty Dog's part to jeopardize said ending. They're perfectly happy to let Nathan Drake finally rest, and I feel the same way. I think it's pretty well established by this point that I love linearity in my platformers. I'm quite fond of the first Sly Cooper. I prefer Jak 2's mission-based gameplay over Jak 1's wide-open collectathon style, and, well, playing an unhealthy amount of Crash Bandicoot is kind of the main thing anybody knows me for. The Super Mario series has been the codifier of so many different types of platformers over the decades, and while I have enjoyed basically every single one I've played, my fondness for linearity reflects in the fact that my favorite Super Mario game is the one that plays that linearity to its fullest potential. That game, of course, being Super Mario 3D World. The Mario games that I've had the most experience with are the 2D ones, and for all intents and purposes, 3D World is a 2D Mario game transferred onto a 3D plane. Level to level progression, 8 worlds to explore, it's the classic formula. And while at a surface level it certainly seems like there's nothing special about 3D World, upon closer examination it really shows how brilliant it is. While it may be using the same coat of paint as many of the 2D Mario titles, Super Mario 3D World excels in its creativity. While there's certainly plenty of classic environments that the series is well known for, there's also quite a lot of unique aesthetics brought to the table. This is further complemented by some absolutely stellar level design with a huge plethora of unique ideas spread throughout them. It feels like every level has something new and fresh to present to you, and the game's structure focusing more on short linear courses instead of wide open exploration allows these ideas to make an impression without overstaying their welcome. Even with the absurdly high amount of content present in the game, it almost never feels stale. The newly introduced power-ups, such as the cat suit and the double cherry, as well as the fact that the game has multiple playable characters, all with their own unique strengths and abilities, just add to the magic. I already loved 3D World in its initial release on Wii U, but the Switch port took an amazing game and made it even better, with the most noteworthy change being a universal buff in movement speed that makes the game feel even crisper and faster paced. There's also an entire second game packaged with it called Bowser's Fury, and I'm gonna be honest, I haven't actually played that. I got too distracted by 3D World itself when I played the Switch port, but I've heard nothing but great things about it. When it comes to 3D Mario games, you can pretty easily distinguish between the wide-open games that emphasize exploration and the linear ones that focus on crisp platforming. Each style has its fans, but I personally have always preferred the latter, and Super Mario 3D World is that type of Mario game done at its finest. The Super Smash Bros. Series has been a cornerstone of my gaming experience for a majority of my life, and while I do love every single game in the series immensely, I generally have very little trouble singling out Brawl as my absolute favorite. And yes, this answer applies both casually and competitively speaking. Let me cover the latter first, since that'll be quicker to talk about and probably is also the more shocking of the two. Brawl being someone's favorite competitive Smash game is not a popular opinion, and I understand why. It's slow-paced, it's unbalanced as hell, it puts an extreme emphasis on neutral interactions, it's just extremely low-key compared to all of the other titles when played in tournament. But honestly, that's what I love about Brawl. Well, maybe not the imbalance. I love Meta Knight, but I do wish he didn't rule the game with an iron fist. But that slow-paced, heavy neutral style that turns so many people away from this game is precisely what attracts me to it. It might not be the flashiest thing in the world, but it's thoughtful and methodical, and I love that so much. I'm a very neutral-heavy player who likes to win off of a million little interactions, and Brawl is just tailor-made for that kind of playstyle, so it just clicks with me. It's certainly an acquired taste, and I fully understand people's disdain for Brawl's slower pace compared to Melee and Ultimate, but it feels like it was made for me. Moving on from that and onto the casual side of things, this is usually what Brawl gets the most praise for, and justifiably so. I don't think there's any other Smash game that is as strong as Brawl is from the perspective of being a casual party game. Some do get close though. While Melee nowadays is almost entirely known for its dedicated competitive scene, it also has a very strong multiplayer mode as well as a shockingly diverse single player experience with a lot of fun game modes to choose from. Ultimate I think falters pretty hard on the single player side of things, but is almost single-handedly carried by having by far the most multiplayer content with over 80 characters and 100 stages to choose from. While Brawl might not have anywhere close to the amount of content as Ultimate, what is there constitutes some of the best the series has to offer. All of the characters play in extremely unique ways, even when some seem like they'd be very similar. The stage list features some of the most entertaining maps to play on without leaning too hard into obnoxious gimmicks like some later introduced stages would. The suite of items also bring about the perfect amount of chaos while again not being as obnoxious as some of those brought in by the later titles. As far as single player is concerned, I actually do find several of Brawl's game modes to be slightly worse than their melee equivalents. However, there's one standout that eclipses everything else, and I think anyone who's played the game knows exactly what I'm talking about: the Subspace Emissary. Being a full-blown single-player campaign with a story and cutscenes, nothing before or after has ever matched the scope and scale of Brawl's adventure mode. The gameplay within it can be a bit repetitive at times, but I still found it to be immensely enjoyable regardless. The Super Smash Bros. Series has evolved a tremendous amount in the years since Brawl's release, but there's still just something so special about it that makes me come back to it time and time again, both as a casual experience and as a competitive game. There really isn't anything quite like it. Those who have been following me for quite a while will probably find this entry shocking because of two revelations. The first being that my favorite Crash Bandicoot game clocked in at number 6, aka not in the top 5, and the second being that my favorite Crash Bandicoot game is, in fact, not Crash Twinsanity. Regarding that first point, it's actually a pretty new development. Crash has consistently sat in my top 3 favorite games for the majority of my life, but a lot of heavy hitters came into the fray extremely recently that were just enough to barely push the orange marsupial out of my top 5. To be frank, this is still surprising even to me, and I made the damn list, so that should say a lot about how highly I regard the remaining games on it. As for the second point, Crash Twinsanity being my favorite Crash game has always been my most well-known Crash Bandicoot hot take, well, either that or my immense disdain for Crash Bash, but I will admit that a lot of that was influenced by my love for it as a speedrun. Don't get me wrong, I also love Twinsanity casually, but in the past year I've suffered an immense burnout from running it, and in the process I've reevaluated my thoughts on the game and concluded that it still doesn't quite match the Naughty Dog games. And of the PS1 trilogy, Crash 2 has always consistently been my favorite since I first played it back in 1997, being the very first video game I ever played in any serious capacity. Sure, in recent years I've started to like Crash 3 on almost equal footing, but Crash 2's biggest strength will always be the fact that it does phenomenally little wrong. Every level is extremely well designed and memorable, with each standing out for having engaging platforming, a cool theme, or both. I also love how incredibly well implemented the game's secrets are. While Crash 1's secrets lean a bit too hard on the cryptic side, and Crash 3's secrets are either too easy or actually impossible without a guide, Crash 2 strikes the perfect balance of providing you enough guidance to figure out what to do, but still requiring enough intuition and cleverness on the player's part to make it feel rewarding to solve. The game was very evidently designed to be completed to its fullest, and it is perfectly built for that purpose. The game's soundtrack is also my favorite in the series, an opinion I voiced in my Crash game ranking video a year and a half ago that I still stand by, with each song adding immensely to making each environment memorable. Really, the only criticisms I can throw at Crash 2 are the heavier emphasis on backtracking and underwhelming boss fights, and honestly I don't think either is that big of a deal. I've also said in the past how I think the hatred towards the backtracking is blown way out of proportion, and while the game does have a good number of stinger boss fights, it also houses one of the series' best in Engine, as well as a very solid one in Tiny. Outside of those two things, I guess the only other thing I can say is that the other games in the series tend to hit higher peaks than Crash 2 does, but Crash 2 doesn't have any of the notable weak points that other games like Crash 1, 3, 4, and Twinsanity have. I don't like to rate games on a numerical scale because doing so tends to oversimplify my feelings on a rather complex medium, but if I were to rate Crash 2 on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd probably give it a 9.5, making it the highest ranking game on this list that I would not award a perfect score. That's right, every single one of my top 5 games is, in my eyes, a 10 out of 10. Let that sink in. Things are about to get crazy. The term perfect isn't one that I throw around lightly, especially when it comes to video games, but I truly don't believe there's another word that better describes a hat in time. Never before or after playing this game have I ever experienced another 3D platformer so clearly derivative of what came before it, but at the same time so flawless in its execution that it manages to stand out both from and above them. It's extremely clear that A Hat in Time is very heavily inspired by Nintendo platformers of the 6th generation. Hell, it follows the basic structure of Super Mario Sunshine to a T. Each chapter features a wide open area to freely explore, but the area changes depending on what act you choose to play, and the progression is still done in a fairly linear fashion. The game's main collectible, the timepieces, are very reminiscent of the Shine Sprites or Superstars of the 3D Mario games, and there's even Sunshine-esque bonus levels called Time Rifts that put your platforming skills to the test. Like I said, A Hat in Time is very clearly based on games of older generations, but it's everything about the way the game is executed that makes for an absolutely unforgettable experience. Even though there are only 4 worlds to explore in the base game, they all feel so distinct and unique from each other. From a bright, lively town to a spooky forest, a free-roaming mountain range, and a Western-style movie set, the way each chapter plays out is so totally different from the others, and in a lot of cases, this would be a death sentence for a game that's clearly trying to do too many things. But with A Hat in Time, it just works. And each chapter has such a colorful cast of characters that are so memorable and add to the game's charm. With so many opportunities to interact with the game's NPCs, every second of play is filled with cute and/or hilarious moments. And the movement, oh my god, the movement. This game has, bar none, the best feeling controls of any 3D platformer that I've ever played. It's so fluid, so crisp, so responsive, and it lends to the platforming itself being such an incredible time, especially when you factor in the different abilities you gain by crafting different hats throughout the game. Your starting hat serves as a guide that points you to your objective, but beyond that you can collect yarn to craft hats that let you sprint, throw explosives, phase objects into reality, become a block of ice, and even slow down time. The game itself is on the short side with only 40 timepieces in the base game, but every single one of those timepieces is so memorable to collect that it never feels like the game is too short. And even then, it received 2 waves of DLC that added 2 more chapters and a series of extra hard challenges to conquer if you so desire. And that's not even factoring in PC exclusive DLC such as online multiplayer. I could go on and on about everything that makes A Hat in Time so amazing. In fact, it would be much easier for me to talk about what isn't great about it, and the answer to that is nothing. The closest I get to an actual complaint is with the first DLC chapter, Arctic Cruise, which is noticeably a lot heavier on time-based missions that are pretty lengthy and tedious. I believe these actually got toned down after their initial release because my replay of it last year wasn't quite as bad as my first experience with it. And even at its worst, it was simply an okay chapter in a game full of incredible ones, and while the missions themselves weren't that amazing, the character interactions were just as memorable as every other part of the game. The second DLC chapter, Yakuza Metro, also more than makes up for it by matching the quality of all the base game chapters. Outside of that though, there's nothing else. There's not a single thing within the base game release of A Hat in Time that I have any criticisms about. It is truly one of the most flawless experiences that I've ever had playing any video game ever, let alone any 3D platformer. I don't use the word perfect to describe things a lot, but that is the only word I can use to properly describe A Hat in Time. It is damn near perfect. I genuinely believed that there would never be another 3D platformer that matched A Hat in Time's quality, at least not for an extremely long time. But then, this year, out of nowhere, we were blessed with a little game called Astrobot, the most recently released game to make it onto this list, and at this current moment, my favorite 3D platformer of all time. Much like A Hat in Time, it would be much easier for me to tell you all the things I didn't like about this game because the answer is, once again, nothing. But unlike A Hat in Time, where I could maybe single out its relatively short length or its underwhelming first DLC chapter, I have genuinely nothing to even remotely criticize about Astrobot. It's just an immaculate experience from start to finish. Let's get the biggest thing out of the way first though. I grew up with a PlayStation, and while I haven't played what I would consider to be a huge amount of their most popular titles, I am able to at least recognize a lot of them, and Astrobot is a massive love letter to PlayStation as a whole. The VIP bots that you rescue that are dressed up as various PlayStation icons are quite possibly this game's biggest treat because the pool of characters that they pull from runs incredibly deep. Sure, you've got your classics like Crash Bandicoot, Lara Croft, Nathan Drake, Solid Snake, and so on, but when I came across VIP bots of characters from games I wasn't even expecting to be remembered, let alone represented, like the cat from Stray or Kana from Kana Bridge of Spirits, you can bet that I was fangirling hard. Each character even has a little blurb that makes some reference to their source material, and it's just so adorable. Okay, but let's say you aren't a PlayStation fan at all. Take that aspect of the game and strip it away. What do you have left then? Well, you have one of the finest 3D platformers ever conceived. The graphics are drop-dead gorgeous, really taking advantage of the PS5's power, and the level design is incredible, with so many things to do and so many places to explore. Even though the level progression is linear like Super Mario 3D World, the areas are still huge and encourage poking around the environment to find everything that you can. And you will want to find everything because all of the bonus content you can unlock is absolutely worth it. From extra challenge levels to different paint jobs for your ship and over a dozen outfits for Astro to wear that make him look like various iconic PlayStation characters, it's all just a joy to work through. The game is bursting with content, but it never feels bloated or tedious at any point because it's all just so much fun to do. A platformer is very heavily defined by its controls, however, and I'm happy to report that Astrobot delivers tremendously on this front. I think I still slightly prefer how A Hat in Time feels, but Astrobot is still an incredibly crisp and responsive game, aided further by it making full use of the haptic vibration and audio capabilities of the DualSense controller. When I spoke about A Hat in Time, I said that there was no better word to describe it than perfect. The same applies to Astrobot. This game is the perfect 3D platformer, there's no better way to put it. If you own a PS5 and you haven't played this game, you are doing yourself a disservice. Astrobot might be my favorite 3D platformer of all time, but if we're talking about my favorite platformer overall, then that title goes to Celeste. This was sitting on my list of games to play for quite a while, but it wasn't until the end of last year going into the beginning of this one that I finally sat down and gave it a try. And while part of me wishes that I had taken that step sooner, I also think that Celeste came into my life at the perfect moment, during a time when I was on my own journey of self-discovery. This was very much intentional on my part, as Celeste is well known for its narrative themes and the eventual confirmation from the main developer that the game's protagonist, Madeline, is a trans woman. The end of last year was about the time that I began to realize that I myself am also a trans woman, and I went into Celeste hoping it would give me some answers regarding this question I was now asking myself. Funnily enough, I didn't come out of it with any more of an understanding of my gender identity, in that moment at least, but I did end up resonating deeply with the game's other themes, namely about depression and anxiety. It's established very early into the game that Madeline is struggling with some amount of personal demons, which are metaphorically represented by the titular Celeste Mountain. Throughout the game, she mentions how determined she is to climb to the top simply because it's something she feels that she needs to do. Going along with this are Madeline's confrontations with the part of her, colloquially known as Badeline, a manifestation of all the things she dislikes about herself and her desperate attempts to free herself from that side of her. As the game progresses, she slowly realizes that Badeline is not a piece of her that needs to be banished, but rather one that she needs to learn to work together with to overcome her personal demons, and it's only by doing so that she's finally able to reach the top of the mountain. These are extremely powerful messages that I relate to as someone who has spent a majority of her adult life struggling with severe depression and anxiety. For many years, I've felt overwhelmed by the obstacles in front of me and the things about myself and my life that I hated, and I've been knocked down a lot. But I've continued to get back up, and much like how Madeline learns how to embrace all parts of her instead of reject those she doesn't like, I have also learned to accept my whole self. This last point is also very applicative to the transgender experience, even if I didn't notice it myself when I first played through the game. The themes of the narrative are further complemented through the gameplay. The platforming in Celeste is notoriously difficult, with a lot of treacherous hazards to make your way through, and dying constantly is almost inevitable. But the game encourages you to keep trying with its design. The controls are basically perfect in their responsiveness. At no point did I ever feel like a mistake wasn't my fault, and with every attempt you feel yourself slowly getting better and gradually working your way towards overcoming the mountain. It makes it feel all the more rewarding when you finally succeed in clearing a difficult obstacle. The game even keeps track of your total number of deaths, but provides no punishment or reward for clearing a level within a certain amount of tries, showing that your mistakes are nothing to be ashamed of and that it's okay to fall constantly as long as you continue to get up and keep trying. While there is a part of me that wishes I played Celeste much sooner than I did, I also can't help but feel grateful that I waited until this year to do so, because it came to me at a time where I was searching for myself and at my most vulnerable. This made it a lot easier for me to resonate with the game's themes and made the experience far more impactful than it might have been if I had played it at a time before I was ready. If you're looking for a game with an impactful narrative, or even just a challenging 2D platformer, then Celeste is the game for you. For many years, I would hear people talk about how incredible Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door was, and every time a new game in the series was revealed, I would observe the disappointment from fans about how far the series had strayed from its roots without fully understanding their pain. Was Thousand-Year Door really that good? But with the release of the Nintendo Switch remake earlier this year, I finally had a chance to get my hands on the game. And now that I've played it for myself, I understand. Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door is one of the most brilliant masterpieces of a video game that I've ever had the joy of playing, and I don't even know where to begin with regards to what makes me love it so much. First off, the game's presentation is fantastic, leaning very hard into the paper storybook aesthetic and even going as far as to implement it into the gameplay with many of the overworld abilities that Mario acquires over time. The gameplay is also a perfect blend between classic turn-based RPGs and the platforming of the mainline Mario series. The combat even ties into the presentation, with battles being represented as performances on a stage, and the audience even has the ability to interact with you, throwing items that either help or harm you if you choose not to interrupt them. Like many other games on this list though, Thousand-Year Door's biggest selling points are its story and its cast. Each of the game's 8 chapters are extremely distinct, but they're all filled with fantastic subplots and characters, and even with each individual chapter being upwards of 3 to 4 hours long, at no point did I ever feel like the game was too long or overstaying its welcome. I was heavily invested in every story and how they tied into the greater plot and each of the characters' personal journeys, the way they grow and develop as the adventure progresses. It's not just the party members though. The side sections where you play as Princess Peach and Bowser are also wonderful, and even the villains have great personalities that help make them iconic. And without spoiling anything, the main antagonist and subsequent final boss is bar none one of the greatest villains and final battles I've ever experienced in any video game. The NPCs are fantastic too, and it makes the entire world you explore such a treat to poke around in. I realize that this is kinda just a standard thing with JRPGs, but it's this type of world building that makes a game feel truly immersive, and I simply adore seeing the world of Mario get this treatment. The tone is even perfect to boot, with it very much matching the lighthearted wackiness of the mainline Mario games, but also knowing very well how to take itself seriously when it needs to. Even now, months after I finished my playthrough of the game, I can vividly remember every single area, every single story beat, every single character that I interacted with, and I don't even feel like I scratched the surface in terms of what there is to experience in this game. I just don't know what else I can say. Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door is one of the most amazing, brilliant games that I've ever experienced. It is hands down my favorite RPG, my favorite Mario game, and my second favorite video game of all time. If you own a Nintendo Switch, please, please, please give this game a go. I cannot recommend it enough. Within the ocean of my ever-evolving opinions, one thing remains constant. My favorite video game of all time is Kingdom Hearts. And as more time passes, I don't think I see that ever changing. The mere idea of a crossover between all of Disney's most iconic properties and Final Fantasy, of all things, is such an outlandish idea that by all metrics should never work. And yet, it does. I wouldn't say that Kingdom Hearts is what made me a Disney fan, because I definitely spent much of my childhood watching the classic films, but seeing all of them together in one game, including several properties from the at the time very recent Disney Renaissance, was a sight to behold that further fueled my love for them. Even better is being able to travel through the worlds of these Disney films and meeting several beloved and iconic characters, from simply interacting with some of them that serve as NPCs to having some of them temporarily join your party. Even if there aren't a lot of the former in this game compared to other more traditional RPGs, there's still enough to make the worlds feel lived in. And while the emptiness of some of the worlds is likely a result of limitations of being an early PS2 game, I feel like Kingdom Hearts gives a good enough reason for this being the case. These worlds are under attack by the forces of darkness, and it's made clear that safely walking around at that moment just isn't really possible. Which brings me to the game's story. I absolutely love it. While it's nothing extremely groundbreaking, the overarching plotline of the Disney villains teaming up to take over all of the worlds is such an amazing concept that seamlessly bridges all of the properties together. And what I really love about this compared to later games in the series is that all of the Disney worlds feel extremely involved in the overall plot. Later on in the series, the Disney worlds would frequently suffer from kind of just being background noise that pad out the game's middle, but in Kingdom Hearts 1, this couldn't be further from the case. Every single world, aside from the optional 100-acre woods, serves some purpose in either furthering the villain's plans or developing the relationships between the characters. And unlike later games' Disney worlds, which quite often would just copy their source material's plot one-to-one and haphazardly throw Sora, Donald, and Goofy into the mix, Kingdom Hearts 1 is much more creative in its approach. Even the worlds that are most faithful to their source material only loosely adapt their plots, and there are several worlds with unique stories that are completely different from the films that they were based on. And for those who are turned off by the ever-increasing complexity of the later game's plot threads, Kingdom Hearts 1's story is extremely straightforward and self-contained, making it very easy for even the most casual of players to digest. Even with the surprisingly dark plotline going on in the game, it still very much feels like a Disney work. That isn't to say that Disney isn't devoid of its dark and disturbing moments, because it very much is chock full of them, but what I mean is that Kingdom Hearts, despite its rather mature premise, still maintains a lighthearted and soft feel to it. It knows when to be goofy and fun, while also knowing when to be dark and menacing. I think this is best exemplified in the game's main enemies, the Heartless. They're beings of pure darkness that spend the entire game stealing people's hearts and aiming to devour the hearts of the worlds in order to destroy them, but at the same time, they're just little guys. Or big guys. Their designs have a cute yet creepy aesthetic to them, and it feels both very Disney and very Final Fantasy. I also mentioned when talking about earlier games on the list how I generally don't care for side quests, but with Kingdom Hearts that couldn't be further from the truth. I adore every single bit of extra content that this game has. From bonus fights such as the Colosseum Cups and the 5 super bosses, to side quests like filling out the journal entries of the various Heartless, rescuing all 99 of the Dalmatian puppies, finding all of the Trinity marks, or even simply poking around the environments to see what you can find, these are all things that give Kingdom Hearts infinite replay value to me, and also serve further to making the worlds feel a lot more complete compared to how linear and empty feeling they can feel in some of the later games. This might sound like I'm ragging on the rest of the series a lot, so I just want to clarify that I love Kingdom Hearts as a whole. It's up there with Crash, Pokemon, and Super Smash Bros. As one of my favorites, if not my absolute favorite. There isn't a game in the series that I consider truly bad, and if I wasn't restricting myself to one game per franchise, Kingdom Hearts 2 would also absolutely be near the top of this list, if not second to the first game. I highlight these things that I prefer about Kingdom Hearts 1, not to shit on the later games, but to emphasize all the little things about the first game that make me adore it as much as I do and push it way over the top to be by far my favorite game, not just in the Kingdom Hearts series, but overall. Really, the only things I would say that Kingdom Hearts 1 doesn't do better than Kingdom Hearts 2 are the combat, which, while not as flashy and definitely more limited in what you can do, still has a good deal of depth and intricacy to it that rewards you for learning how to make the most out of your arsenal, and the 100-acre wood minigames, which, I'm not really going to hold that as a major point in KH2's favor, I'm sorry. I will also acknowledge that Kingdom Hearts 1 doesn't handle higher difficulties as well as Kingdom Hearts 2 and 3 because it simply wasn't designed for them. The latter two games designed their higher difficulty modes around being able to masterfully block and dodge attacks, but the way combat works in Kingdom Hearts 1 makes it unrealistic to not simply tank stray hits, and this makes higher difficulties feel tedious and unfair compared to how satisfying and rewarding it feels in later entries. This makes infinitely more sense when you learn that the original Japanese release of Kingdom Hearts 1 didn't have difficulties. The English version added an expert mode, and the final mix re-release established the beginner, standard, and proud difficulties that are now the series' staple, with the HD remaster going further and adding level 1 into the mix. The difficulty options were quite literally tacked on. On that note, the last thing that I'll mention is that for other games on the list, I singled out a specific version of those games that I liked, and while Kingdom Hearts does have an updated re-release known as Kingdom Hearts Final Mix, I neglected to specify it and simply said my favorite game is Kingdom Hearts. That's because, to me, it frankly doesn't matter which version of the game I'm playing. While I will acknowledge that the HD remaster of Final Mix on modern consoles and PC is the best way to experience the game due to faster loads, the ability to skip cutscenes, and having all the bonus content that wasn't in the original version of the game, at the end of the day, you could put any version of Kingdom Hearts in front of me and I will still enjoy it more than any other video game in existence. I've probably been rambling this whole time, going from one thought to the next as I think about more and more things that I love about this game, but that's just how it is for me with Kingdom Hearts. I love every single thing about it, and there's simply no way for me to go over all of it in one video. There isn't a single other game in the world that means even close to as much to me as Kingdom Hearts does, and that is why it is now, and quite possibly forever, my favorite video game of all time. Hi everyone, so this is just a bit of an unscripted part of the video. I just wanted to say, first off, thank you to everyone who sat through all of these videos and watched them. That really means the world to me. I knew going in that this series of videos was not going to do as well as my normal content. Just, kind of just a combination of not being crash or speedrunning videos, which is what I'm most known for, and just each individual daily video being on the short side is just not really playing well to the algorithm. But this is a series of videos that I have wanted to do for many, many years, and I'm just very happy that I was able to do it, and I'm very proud of the videos and how they turned out, even if they're not necessarily doing well analytics-wise. And I hope that the people who have seen them have really enjoyed them as much as I enjoyed making them. I wanted to apologize again for just really not making a lot of videos this year. It's been a very interesting year for me. There's been a lot of personal trials and growth and self-discovery. Like I mentioned in my update video, just learning that I am trans was a big journey for me this year, and also just realizing that the thing that I felt like I was forcing myself to do, where I was doing just crash videos and just speedrunning videos, just really wasn't making me as happy as I wanted it to. And I'm not going to stop making those videos, but I'm going to make them at a time where I feel it's right. And I do also want to, focus on just making whatever is going to make me happy. And I'm hoping that I can put out a lot more videos next year, even if they're not, necessarily crash-related videos or speedrunning ones. But I hope that you all will enjoy them regardless. And yeah, I knew the risks I was taking when I switched to full-time content creation 2 years ago, and I'm still willing to take that risk for as long as I can to continue making videos that I really like and that I hope other people really like. And with that, yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you all in 2025.